rise.
Please be seated. Now, this morning we have Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor, Mr. Benelli, you're appearing for Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Mayor. Please, the Commission, I do appear. It's Albert Denali, and I appear on behalf of Mr. McGregor.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor, would you just give us your full name for the record?
Yes, good morning, Alan Frank McGregor.
And I understand you wish to affirm?
Yes, thank you.
And do you have the words of the affirmation?
No, I don't, I'm sorry.
Well then, if you could just repeat after me. I, Alan McGregor.
I, Alan McGregor.
Sincerely declare and affirm.
Sincerely declare and affirm.
That the evidence that I shall give to this Commission.
The evidence that I shall give to this Commission.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGregor. Mr. Denelli.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. McGregor, you prepared a statement dated the 6th of August 2021 in response to a summons dated the 6th of July 2021. Is that right?
That's correct.
And do you have a copy of your statement with you, Mr. McGregor?
Yes, I do.
And can I identify that document? Does it bear the ID CRW.998.002.021?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Can I take you to the very last page of it, which is numbered .0246?
Yes.
And is that a schedule of documents?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Is the statement true and correct to the best of your information and belief?
Yes, it is.
Commissioners, I tender that statement with its schedule, if I may. Thank you, Mr. Denali. The witness statement of Alan McGregor with its schedules, dated the 6th of August 2021 and bearing the identifier number CRW.998.002.021. Ms. Kay.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. McGregor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. If you've got your witness statement in front of you and go to paragraph 11 at page 0220, you identify that you presently hold the position of Chief Financial Officer of Crown Resorts Limited, the position that you were appointed to on 20 August 2020. Do you know if you presently hold that position on an interim basis pending the recruitment of a permanent appointee, or whether you have been appointed permanently to that position?
I was permanently appointed to the position of Chief Financial Officer of Crown Resorts in August last year upon receiving the final probity clearances.
And you intend to remain in that position for the foreseeable future, do you?
Yes, I do.
Sorry, Ms Cahill, could we just change the screen view? And sorry, Mr Denelli, I don't know that we need to see you.
No, of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, paragraph 12 on the same page, you identify the various positions that you hold on different entities within the Crown Group. Taking 12A, your appointment as Secretary of Burswood Limited, is that an interim or permanent position?
I expect that may be an interim position. So I was appointed as an interim Company Secretary of Crown Resorts Limited as per 12D on the 18th of February 2021, and that role was interim because there was a restructure at the time and we're in the process of recruiting for a Company Secretary of Crown Resorts. So when that position is filled, I expect that I will step down as interim Company Secretary.
So coming back to 12A, Secretary of Burswood Limited, you expect that's an interim position. Why do you say that?
It may be an interim position due to the replacement and the appointment of the Company Secretary of Crown Resorts. Typically, not always, but typically the Company Secretary of Crown Resorts Limited occupies the co-sec roles for the key subsidiary boards as well.
And at B, Director of Burswood Nominees Limited, is that an interim or permanent position?
I think that'll be a permanent position.
Why do you think that?
Because again, those are subsidiary boards of the key holding company being Burswood Limited, and it's fairly typical for the Chief Financial Officer of Crown Resorts to fill those positions.
And the role of Secretary of Burswood Nominees?
Yeah, the same thing.
You expect that to be permanent?
Yes.
And a Director of Burswood Resort Management? And
Yes,
Secretary?
permanent.
And a
Yes.
Secretary permanent? Yes?
Yes.
Now, you explain at paragraph 25 at page 0222 that before you joined Crown Perth in 2005, you'd been working in finance-related positions in the casino industry since 1997, that was some 8 years. You understood by the time you arrived at Perth Casino that casino operations generally were particularly vulnerable to the risk of being used to facilitate money laundering, weren't you?
I was aware, I'm aware that casino industry generally is, yes.
And you also understood that junket tours posed particular risks to the operations of casinos hosting such tours in terms of being used to facilitate money laundering or being infiltrated by criminals.
Yes, I've come to probably realise that more so in terms of your previous question and this question, more so in recent years than I did at the time.
But you were aware of those risks in 2005, weren't you?
Yes.
Now, if we come back to paragraph 7 at page 0219, I want to ask you some questions about your role of Chief Financial Officer of Crown Perth between 2007 and April 2013. In that role, you were the person primarily and ultimately responsible for the financial management of the Perth Casino, is that right?
Yes, that's fair.
And your duties included, I'm not stating them exhaustively, Mr. McGregor, just included the accurate recording of all financial transactions involving the Perth Casino?
Yes.
The recording of those transactions with, in accordance with any legal requirements?
Yes.
The calculation and payment of taxes?
Yes.
Both federal and state?
Mostly state taxes in that role. Federal taxes were undertaken by the corporate group.
So the CRL, Chief Financial Officer?
Crown Resorts Limited, yes.
You were responsible for financial forecasting, including cash flow forecasting in respect of the Perth Casino?
Yes.
Budgeting?
Yes.
Financing?
Depends on what you mean by financing.
Financing of any capital works for the Perth Casino or any financing that was required for its operations?
Financing for capital projects, yes.
But not any financing required for operations otherwise?
Well, I guess I'm making the distinction between financing arrangements in terms of bank financing and finance facilities, which were taken care of by the Crown Resorts Limited Group.
And as a CFO of Crown Perth or Perth Casino, you had the management of the Perth Casino's bank accounts, didn't you?
Again, the treasury function and the bank account engagement and function was largely led by the Crown Resorts Limited corporate treasury team.
We'll come back to that later, Mr. McGregor, but are you saying you did not have ultimate responsibility for the management of Perth Casino's bank accounts?
Yes, that's right.
Did you have any responsibility for the management of Perth Casino's bank accounts?
Yes, to the extent that, for example, the bank reconciliation process, the external audit process in terms of bank confirmations and the like would have fallen within the remit of my responsibility at Perth.
So you would have had to have organised for, as part of the external financial audit on an annual basis, for those bank accounts to be the subject of an audit.
Yes.
And you also were responsible, weren't you, for ensuring that any transactions in respect of those bank accounts were properly and accurately recorded?
Yes.
You were responsible as CFO of Perth Casino for the compilation and presentation of Perth Casino's financial accounts?
Yes.
And for those financial accounts to be compiled and presented accurately?
Yes, that's right.
And in accordance with all legal requirements?
Yes.
You were responsible for accurately reporting to the CEO of Crown Perth and Burswood Limited the historical financial performance of Perth Casino on a monthly, half-yearly and yearly basis?
Yes.
And you were primarily responsible, as you said a moment ago, for arranging for the external auditing of Perth Casino's financial accounts?
Yes, although the external auditor was engaged primarily, again, at the Crown Resorts group level, but they performed audit functions on Crown Perth as a key subsidiary of the group.
And you were primarily responsible for overseeing that process?
Yes.
And dealing with the auditors?
Yes, that's right.
Were you also primarily responsible for the internal auditing process in respect of Perth Casino's finances?
I can't recall whether that was from the outset. I think the internal audit team might have reported to me at some stage during those early years, but I can't be clear on that.
Well, in terms of the Perth Casino's finances, you would have had to have at least been intimately involved with the internal audit process in respect of Perth Casino's finances. Would you agree?
I would have been aware of the internal audit processes as they pertained to financial arrangements, yes.
Well, you would have had to have been involved in them, providing information to the internal audit team?
Well, usually they would have conducted their internal audit with key engagements with some of my team members, not necessarily me as the CFO, but I would have seen the final report.
Well, you would have been responsible for the team with whom internal audit liaised.
Yes, that's right.
So you're ultimately responsible for that liaison?
Well, yes, I'm responsible for my team's liaison with the internal audit team and completing their duties, yes.
Yes. And is it your evidence that you weren't, in fact, in charge of the internal audit of Perth Casino's finances?
I can't recall whether they reported to me throughout that period or at all. The internal audit team sort of, from my memory, may have reported up to the legal and compliance teams. But I could stand corrected on that, I just can't recall.
You were the person at Perth Casino in your role as CFO who was primarily responsible for identifying and managing financial risks of the Perth Casino operations, weren't you?
It depends on what you mean by financial risks.
Credit risks. Credit risks?
No, there was a VIP team that specifically, and with the casino business, or certainly with ours, most of the credit risk came from the VIP business. And so there was a VIP credit team that looked after that particular credit risk. There was some non-gaming elements to credit in and around convention and events business, and I certainly had ultimate responsibility for that. And I was involved in reviewing in meetings and reviewing the debt position of the VIP credit team as well.
So you were involved in, but not responsible for, identifying and managing credit risk associated with VIP business?
Yes.
And the responsibility rested with the VIP team?
Yes.
Liquidity risks, you were responsible for identifying and managing those in respect of Perth casino operations?
Not during that period. Again, that would have been liquidity and treasury management, cash flow management. It has ultimately been the responsibility of the Crown Resorts corporate treasury team.
So again, were you involved in but not responsible for identifying and managing those risks?
I probably wasn't overly involved with those, other than obviously monitoring or being aware of and monitoring general cash flows in and out of the business as and when they became due.
Well, that's being fairly involved, isn't it?
Yes.
Fraud risk, were you responsible for identifying and managing fraud risk?
Not that I can recall, no. I think the fraud management risk was held at the legal and compliance teams.
You would, however, have been involved, wouldn't you, by reason of your oversight of the financial accounts of Perth Casino?
Yes.
And it would necessarily have been part of your function to identify any evidence of fraudulent activity in respect of Perth Casino's financial affairs.
Yes.
Now, if we go to this document, which is referred to at paragraph 23 at page 0222 of your witness statement, CRW.512.239.0013, you've referred to this here because this is your job description for your role as CFO Crown Perth between 2007 and April 2013. Is that right?
Yes.
And in that role, you reported to the Chief Executive Officer of Perth Casino. Is that the case?
Yes.
And if we go to the front page here, and that second dot point on the left-hand side of the screen, Mr. McGregor, under primary objectives of this role, you see it, thank you, it's been popped out for you.
Thank you.
You see direct control and administer financial activities of the company, and then it says through the finance department. Can you tell me, please, what was the role of the finance department in respect of Perth Casino when you were CFO between 2007 and April 2013?
Yes, it was to be responsible for things such as monthly, yearly reporting on historical performance, forecasting, budgeting, the payroll function, accounts payable function, monitoring fixed assets and general ledger as it says up on the screen. And there was an income control function as well, which managed the, which is a typical function in a hospitality venue, which managed the operations of the hotel and the convention business in particular.
And the finance department was where transactions were primarily recorded?
Yes.
And you headed the finance department?
Yes.
On page 0014, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, if we could pop that back, please, you'll see in the table there where it identifies reporting relationships in the second column, first dot point, a position directly reporting to you was the financial controller. See that?
Yes, that's right.
Who was that?
Well, there was a few people during my tenure back then from memory. I think it was Craig Spence for a little while, and then Vasula Kessel was appointed into that role, and she occupies that role now.
Now, if you drop down to the third bullet point in that same column, there's a reference to a credit administrator who reports to you.
Mm-hmm.
And was that a credit administrator responsible for credit arrangements outside of VIP business?
No, I think that credit administrator from memory did report on VIP business.
So that person reported to you in respect of that function?
Yes.
So you did have an involvement in the credit, sorry, I withdraw that. You did have a responsibility for the credit arrangements in respect of VIP business?
Yes, this was one person in Perth at the time from memory. She was domiciled in Perth, and you see our VIP business was largely led in a group way. So she managed the administration of reporting and the like on VIP credit.
But she didn't report to a group role, she reported to you?
That's right, yes.
And you were responsible for her?
Yes.
Now, was this credit administrator, as I understood your answer a moment ago, was not part of a wider credit team?
She worked with the wider credit team very closely.
All right.
I think she reported to me, but my apologies, sorry.
Sorry, did you name this credit administrator a minute ago or not?
No, I didn't.
So who was it?
I think her name was Heather Graham. This is a long time ago. I'm just trying to remember.
So the credit administrator was a standalone, was it, VIP business related credit administrator who reported to you?
Yes, and I think she reported to me back then because, as I said, she was domiciled in Perth as I was, and the VIP team was largely housed in Melbourne. So it made sense for her to report through to somebody who was in Perth.
And you made reference to a credit team separately from this credit administrator a moment ago. Was that a credit team as part of the finance department?
No, it wasn't. There's a VIP credit team in Melbourne, which is largely a group VIP credit team across the VIP business generally.
And in relation to the credit function exclusive of VIP business that you talked about a little while ago, was that carried out by the finance department?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
So when I was asking you a moment ago about your responsibility for credit functions, you distinguished between VIP business and credit function otherwise. You recall
yes.
that? So
I do.
So that credit function otherwise, was that carried out by the finance department?
I think it was from memory, yes.
Now, staying with this document at 0014, second dot point refers to the cage manager. You see that?
Yes.
The cage manager reported to you.
That's right.
And the cage manager was obviously the manager of the cage operation.
That's right.
And who was in that role while you were CFO of the Perth Casino?
It was largely David Brown from memory. I don't think there was anyone prior to him, but I think it was mainly David Brown.
And was the cage operation a part of the finance department or separate from it?
It was separate.
And what was the role of the cage operation?
It was what's a common role in a casino. It is the business unit that looks after all of the cash, chips, table games chips, manages the engagement with the customer in terms of sharing or making the transactions between cash and chips at the casino cages.
And was there any overlap between the cage operation functions and the finance department functions?
No, not really.
What about in relation to recording financial transactions?
Well, the financial transactions were largely recorded through the casino management system, Psycho, which interfaced with the general ledger. So there was really not a lot of manual interaction other than probably in the income control team that I mentioned before in terms of processing gaming type transactions from the casino management system into the GL.
So who did that, the Cage or the finance department?
Well, both. The Cage were responsible for, and there was a number of inputs into the casino management system, as you'd appreciate from the operating areas of tables and machines and everywhere else. So there was a number of inputs into that system, and then ultimately that would interface with the general ledger financial management system to produce financial reports.
So obviously you have people interacting with Psycho to enter data into it, don't you?
Yes.
And both the Cage and operators and the finance department staff would perform that function.
Well, Cage are more data entry into the function. The finance team are largely recipients of the information.
So when
Does that make sense?
So when it comes to, for example, bank accounts used for gaming that Perth Casino had, and there were transactions between those accounts, which area was it, the Cage or the finance department who was responsible for entering those transactions?
The Cage.
And who was responsible for making sure that those transactions were entered accurately?
Oh, ultimately the Cage.
And why do you say ultimately?
Well, because they were the first line of engagement, if you like, and so they would be the ones who would enter the information into Psycho. And as I said, the finance team were recipients of that information and converting it into a general ledger format where it was into a financial statement format.
Did the finance department have any responsibility to review those transactions to make sure that they were accurately and appropriately recorded by the Cage?
No.
So who did review the Cage's work to see that it was accurately and appropriately recording transactions?
Well, there was a sort of a number of areas, I guess. One would have been the AML and compliance team after they'd entered information into Psycho. Another area of the business that would have viewed the information would have been the VIP teams in terms of information going in there with respect to VIP players. The gaming teams may have reviewed that sort of information in terms of monitoring the performance of the tables and machines business, for example.
Who had the responsibility to ensure that the Cage entered transactions accurately and appropriately?
The Cage.
And then ultimately you, because you were responsible for the Cage.
That's right.
Besides the manager of the Cage operation, who else worked within the Cage?
Oh, there was a large team of people. The general manager of the Cage had shift managers and area managers below him, casino cashiers, count room.
So there were shift managers overseeing casino cashiers, you described? Yes?
Yes, there would have been shift managers. There would have been supervisors, casino cashiers, that sort of structure.
Well, let's try and be a little bit more precise. On every shift, you had a manager in the Cage, did you?
On every shift, there would typically be a shift manager or someone who is acting in the shift manager role, that's right.
And then immediately below the manager would be a supervisor?
Yes, or a number of supervisors.
All right. And then underneath the supervisor was a cashier?
A number of cashiers at the windows, yes.
And any other roles?
Would have been, there's a count team, so there's effectively a count room which does exactly that, counts Councillor Drop from Cash from the floor. That's a small group of people that do that daily.
How many?
Half a dozen.
And are they there 24/7 in shifts?
No, they typically come in early in the morning and complete their role, and then they're sort of gone by midday or early afternoon, typically.
And any other roles aside from the ones you've just mentioned?
In the cage team?
Yes.
Not that I can recall.
All right. So then coming back to a shift with the managers, supervisors and cashiers, you'd have one manager on a shift?
Typically, although if it was a particularly busy period or an event or something like that, you might have two.
And typically how many supervisors in a shift?
I couldn't tell you with any accuracy. This is some time ago.
Well, roughly. Roughly.
Well, as I said, you may have 1 to 2 shift managers, supervisors, maybe half a dozen.
And roughly how many cashiers?
Well, it depended on what shift it was. Again, if it was a night shift, you'd have a couple of the cage windows open, and if it was a sort of a overnight shift, you might only have one.
So provide a
So
range.
it'd depend on.
So provide a
Pardon me?
range, please. Provide a range of numbers.
Look, again, I can't tell you with any accuracy. I'll be guessing.
Yeah. So
I'd say.
you can
sorry?
give me an estimate, please.
In downtime, it might be, and they'd be swinging through the shifts. It'd be, I don't know, 6 to 8 on a low period, and maybe 15 on a high period. But again, I'm guessing.
And the supervisors and the managers, when they're on a shift, part of their responsibility is to ensure that transactions are being entered by the cashiers accurately and appropriately.
Yes.
And the numbers that you just gave me and the structure you just gave me was for how the main cage was set up. Is that right?
That's the main cage, but also the cage in the pearl room or the premium room, for example, would have been a similar structure. It might have had a more exposure to management teams for obvious reasons, because it would have had higher transaction levels.
And there was a cage at the pearl room, and there was one other cage, wasn't there?
Yeah, yes, the main cage.
So the main cage, the pearl room cage, and was there another cage?
Yes,
Where was that?
it was on the main gaming floor.
Right. And was that a smaller cage than the pearl room and the main cage?
The pearl room was the smallest cage.
Right. How big was the main floor cage?
How many windows? It would have been, I don't know, 6 or 8 windows maybe.
So are we at cross purposes here? You've identified the main cage and you've given me the size of that in rough terms.
Yes.
The pearl room is a bit smaller.
Yes, it's only got 2 windows from memory, 2 to 3.
And then there's another cage on the main gaming floor that's somewhere in between those two in terms of size.
Right.
Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
And coming back to the main cage, is it located separately physically from the finance department?
Yes, it's on the gaming floor.
And what's the purpose of having 2, the main cage and then another cage on the main gaming floor?
Oh, just to service the customers. It's a fairly large floor, so it's a customer service piece.
Now, at paragraph 8 of your witness statement, page 0220, you identify the roles that you had in the Burswood entities while you were CFO of Crown Perth, in addition to your role as CFO. Now, just in terms of Burswood Limited, at page 0224, paragraph 37, you see there in the second sentence, you say in terms that it's Burswood Limited, not Burswood Nominees, that sets the strategic direction for the Crown Perth business. See that?
Yes.
Are you speaking as to the position that pertains now, or historically, or both?
Probably more historically than now.
Right, now
Although now I think that statement is still correct.
But you're making a distinction as if there's been a change in emphasis. Is that right, over time?
Potentially.
Well, what do you mean, Mr. McGregor?
I mean that in my, and I'm only speaking from my own experience, obviously, in the early years in my time at Perth, I was obviously not privy to the operation of the Crown Resorts Board or the other entities. So I was just reporting through to the Burswood Limited Board. Since my tenure in the CFO Australian Resorts and more recently in my current role, I can see that there is, there are representatives from the Crown Resorts teams on the Burswood Limited Board, as there always has been, and how the Crown Resorts group interacts with and meets and discusses the Perth business.
So do you consider that CRL has increased its influence over the strategic direction of the Perth casino operations over time?
I think that's a fair statement, yes.
So who would you say controls the Perth casino business in terms of a corporate entity?
The Burswood Limited Board as a holding company.
Albeit that it's influenced in its control by CRL. Is that the effect of your...
Yes. Yes, I think obviously the Perth property, the Burswood group of companies are wholly owned subsidiaries of the Crown Resorts group, as is Melbourne, as is Sydney. So ultimately the Crown Resorts board has ultimate responsibility for the strategic direction of all three of those entities.
Now, coming back to the historical position, when you were CFO at Crown Perth, you were appointed to the position of company secretary of Burswood Limited because you were CFO, you recall that?
Yes.
And it was also because you were CFO of Crown Perth that you were made a director and secretary of Burswood Nominees and Burswood Resort Management, is that right?
That's right.
And you attended, when you were CFO of Crown Perth, all meetings of the Burswood Limited Board?
I would have, yes, I was an invitee of the Burswood Limited Board and I would have attended most, if not all of them.
And you reported to the Burswood Limited Board at those meetings in relation to the financial affairs of the Perth Casino?
Yes, in conjunction with the CEO, that's right.
Did you present budgets, financial budgets, to the Burswood Limited Board?
Yes, I think so. And again, the CEO and myself and the Chief Operating Officer would have presented the budgets and the business plans to the board. And
were those budgets approved by the Burswood Limited Board or simply just noted?
My recollection at the time, and I'm making a distinction now between probably what I thought at the time versus what I perhaps have read and have seen in recent times. My understanding of it at the time and right up until probably fairly recently was that we were presenting those budgets and plans to the Burswood Limited board for their review and approval. But I've since obviously been privy to the fact that I don't think in all cases there were resolutions in the minutes approving those budgets and plans by the Burswood Limited board.
Did you, at the time, present the same budgets to the CRL board for review and approval?
In a consolidated fashion with the rest of the business. Oh, no, sorry, my apologies. In the time I was in Perth, from 07 to 13, I did not attend the Crown Resorts Board or any of its committees.
Did you have any knowledge of those budgets, those same budgets, being presented to the CRL board for review and approval by somebody else?
I think I probably would have been aware that they were being presented up the chain to the ultimate parent company, yes.
For review and approval?
Yes.
Now, when you were Chief Financial Officer of Crown Perth up until April 2013, there was also a CFO of Crown Melbourne, wasn't there?
That's right.
And a CFO of Crown Resorts, I think you've mentioned that.
Yes. What
was the nature of your interaction with each of those officers?
The probably more interaction with the CFO of Crown Melbourne, because she, Ms Henwood, I replaced her in Perth, and I certainly looked upon, this was my first CFO role into the Perth business, so I looked upon her as somewhat of a mentor and sought her guidance from time to time in terms of my tenure at Perth.
Did you have
in terms of my interaction?
Sorry, you go.
Sorry. In terms of my interaction with the Crown Resorts CFO, look, I can't really recall. I don't recall there being a lot, other than from time to time they may be phoning up about financial matters or reports. Did
you have a direct or dotted line reporting responsibility to the CFO of Crown Resorts?
Not officially. I reported to the CEO of Crown Perth at the time. So no, I don't think there was a dotted line arrangement.
In relation to capital expenditure for Perth casino operations between 2007 and 2013, how were these funded?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
In relation to capital expenditure for Perth casino operations or capital works between 2007 and 2013, how was that expenditure funded?
Typically what would happen is there would be an allocation of capital funds in a base capex arrangement, for example. So there may be an amount, let's say $35 or $40 million a year assigned to the Perth business to use on what we determine base or maintenance capex, and that could be determined by their management team in Perth and shared with the board. If there were any more material projects from a capital nature that needed to be funded, they would be presented first and foremost to the Burswood Limited board for a review and approval, and then I think probably presented to the resorts board for their approval as well.
But what was the source of the funding? Did it come through CRL?
Well, it depended. So, for example, if it was maintenance capex, it was probably funded from profits generated from Perth. If it was a large project, it may have been funded by Crown Resorts. For example, Crown Towers Perth, it was a significant project for us in Perth, $650 million, and a lot of that was funded by the parent company.
That was after your move to Melbourne, though, wasn't it?
That's right.
Now, I want to just ask you quickly about the ERCC. You describe at paragraph 14 of your witness statement, page 0220, you were a member of the Executive Risk and Compliance Committee from 2008, when that committee was established, until 2014. Is that right?
Yes, until April 2013 when I moved to Melbourne, that's right.
And do you say that you weren't a member after that?
For that short time between April 13 and August 14, I was in the role of Crown Melbourne CFO specifically, so I was not responsible for anything to do with Perth and did not attend the ERCC meetings during that period.
But when after that, in 2014, you were made CFO of Australian Resorts, you resumed your membership of ERCC, didn't you?
In Perth, that's right.
Yeah. Now, back when you were CFO of Perth, you were a member of the ERCC because you were CFO of Perth, right?
That's right.
And you understood the ERCC was responsible for providing risk and compliance oversight for Crown Perth?
Yes.
And that encompassed all material business risks that Crown Perth had?
Yes, it was a wide-ranging charter.
And the ERCC approved Crown Perth's risk management strategy document, didn't it?
I think it did, yes.
And at the time, that was Crown Perth's own document, not one that was shared jointly with Crown Melbourne or CRL.
That's right.
And apart from your oversight role in respect of risk and compliance as a member of that committee, you also contributed as CFO to inform ERCC of the manner of management of material financial risks, didn't you?
Yes, I was a member of the ERCC committee and contributed where I could.
Now, the ERCC also had oversight over AML risk, didn't it?
Yes.
And if we go to paragraph 98 of your witness statement, page 0232, you say responsibility sat largely with the legal and compliance team while you were CFO of Crown Perth.
Yes, that's my recollection.
But you were responsible for the cage operation, not legal and compliance.
That's right.
And that was the case until 2013 when you moved to Melbourne.
That's correct.
And you say here in this paragraph, you'll see the third sentence, the cage had to work closely with the legal and compliance teams on AML compliance. You see that?
Yes.
But in any event, you had responsibility for the overall financial management and oversight of that, didn't you?
I had responsibility for the cage, yes.
Well, for the overall financial management of the Perth casino operations.
Yes.
And that meant that not just the cage, but you yourself would need to work closely with legal and compliance to ensure that AML risks were appropriately managed in the cage. Would you agree?
Not necessarily. I think the cage reported to me there was a compliance committee, as I recall, that had members of, or senior management members of a number of different parts of the business, and they would have been AML, compliance, the cage, VIP, and they met, as I recall, pretty regularly. And they didn't always have representatives from the executive teams at those meetings. The people who attended those compliance committees effectively reported up through their chains of command, so to speak, on any matters that were worthy of raising.
AML compliance.
So I didn't attend.
AML compliance.
My apologies.
AML compliance on a day-to-day basis at Perth Casino depended in part upon your cooperation as to the financial management of Perth Casino. You'd agree?
I'm sorry, my cooperation? I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
You were the CFO of Perth Casino, weren't you?
Yes.
And
yes.
You were responsible for its financial management.
Yes.
And for such things as recording accurately financial transactions?
Yes.
And financial transactions being recorded appropriately.
Yes.
And to identify and mitigate financial risks.
Yes, that was part of my responsibility along with others, yes.
So when it comes to legal and compliance, identifying how it's going to identify and manage AML risk, it needs to work closely with you in relation to your area of responsibility, which I've just described.
Yes, and I think that's right. But as I said, the teams worked closely together. The way it worked, as I recall, was my team, the legal and compliance teams, the AML teams worked closely together and regularly met on those matters. And when there were items to be escalated or items for discussion at a more executive level, they would find their way either up to the executive team or the Executive Risk and Compliance Committee for discussion.
But you're not separate from your team, are you?
No, I'm not saying I am.
You're just at the head of the team.
Yes.
And as part of that team, at the head of it, you had to work closely with legal and compliance to identify and manage AML risk. You'd agree with that?
Through the ERCC teams and liaison with my colleagues, yes.
No, not through the ERCC, Mr. McGregor, separately and in addition to that, in your day-to-day work, overseeing the financial management of Perth Casino, as part of your team, you had to work closely with legal and compliance to identify and manage AML risk. Would you agree?
Well, as I've said, the way it worked was that the teams worked closely together and they reported up to their various managers in terms of responsibility for financial risks and AML risk.
You had
and I was a part of that executive team that was responsible for those risks.
Yes, but not just as part of the ERCC, as part of your role as CFO. You had a responsibility to work with legal and compliance to make sure that AML risks were identified and appropriately managed. Would you agree?
Yes, we all had a responsibility to do that.
You had to help them to do their job.
Where I could, yes.
Well, you were very well positioned to do that because you were the responsible one for financial management at Perth Casino. Would you agree?
I was well equipped in terms of the financial management, yes, but I was not an expert in AML matters.
Well, you knew a lot about it because you were on the ERCC. You actually had an oversight role in relation to AML risk identification and management. So you knew quite a bit about it, didn't you?
I was aware of the issues through my, through my attendance at the ERCC meetings, general executive team meetings, and engagement with my colleagues and the legal and compliance teams throughout the course of business.
You did more than just simply attend ERCC meetings. You oversaw, as a member of ERCC, the AML risk identification and management function, didn't you?
Oh, as a member of the ERCC team, yes.
Thank you. Now, can I take you to your role as Chief Financial Officer of Crown Melbourne? So that was in April 2013. You moved to Melbourne to assume that role?
Yes, that's right.
You held that position for a little over a year?
Yes.
You had the same responsibilities as you had in relation to Perth Casino, but in this time in relation to Crown Melbourne?
Yes, I think that's largely correct.
Was there a CFO appointed in your place for Crown Perth for that year that you were CFO of Crown Melbourne?
Yes.
And who was that?
That was Mr. Craig Spence.
Now, you then become the CFO of Australian Resorts in August 2014.
That's right.
Explain at paragraph 20, page 0222, that when you assumed that role, you became responsible for the overall financial management of Crown Perth and Crown Melbourne. Do I understand from that that you then became effectively CFO, Crown Perth and Crown Melbourne?
That's fair, yes.
And so what happened to Mr. Spence?
His position was made redundant.
And in the role of CFO Australian Resorts, you reported to Barry Felsted as CEO of Australian Resorts. Is that right?
That's right.
And when you became responsible as CFO for both Perth and Melbourne, did you spend much time physically in Perth?
Yes, I would generally be there for the board meetings physically, and possibly, 2 to 3 other times during the course of the year for other things, or for a general catch up with my team.
Thank you. Now I'll take you to CRW.708.005.8302, which is a letter from Mr. Felsted to Mr. Connolly of the 25th of August 2014. So this is not a letter that you've, I'm not suggesting that you've written this letter, Mr. McGregor, but it refers to you, it notifies Mr. Connolly of your appointment to the CFO position of Australian Resorts. And you've read this letter, you're familiar with it?
I've glanced at it in the course of reviewing materials last night.
What was the...
I hadn't seen it before last night.
What was the reason for the consolidation of the CFO roles across Crown Melbourne and Crown Perth?
During that period around 2014, there was a number of movements we were making as a business to consolidate support functions. Prior to that period, as we've been talking about, Perth and Melbourne largely operated separately from one another. They had their own management teams, their own structures, and there wasn't a lot of crossover. That to us at the time, as I recall, seemed a bit inefficient in that both properties operated integrated resorts. They did very similar things, obviously. So we took the view that some of the support functions like finance, like marketing, like IT and the like, and ultimately the management of the businesses with the appointment of Mr. Felsted as CEO of Australian Resorts could be done via some group functions looking after those support areas. And finance was one of those areas that was identified.
Right, now at the third paragraph on the first page of this document in front of you, it explains that you were formerly the CFO of Crown Perth. And then the second sentence, it says, Mr. McGregor has a very strong knowledge of the Crown Perth business. Was that true? Was that a true statement at the time it was made?
I think so. I had lived and worked in Perth for some 7 years by that stage.
Now, if we zoom out again, please, so I have the document on the full page. And you'll see the penultimate paragraph on this page refers to an attached job description for you that commences at 8304. If we go to that, please. Thank you. Now, this has your direct reports. You'll see there that each of the financial controllers in Perth and Melbourne reported directly to you. Those jobs were located in Perth and Melbourne respectively, were they?
Yes.
And did the finance department in Perth retain the same role and structure as you've described to us it had when you were CFO of Perth between 2007 and 2013?
Largely it did, yes.
So that remained the same through 2014 to 2020?
Yes, predominantly the same.
And apart from the financial controller, who were the most senior members of the Perth Finance Department between 2014 and 2020?
There was a couple of management accountants that were reasonably senior that supported Vasula,
Right,
Ms. Kessel.
so Ms Kessel was still the financial controller through to 2020?
She remains the financial controller today, that's right.
Yeah. And then who were the other senior people that you've just identified their roles?
There was a hotels management accountant, Ms. Xiao, and there was another individual, or there is, I should say, Mr. Lamb.
Sorry, who was that?
Mr. Lamb,
And what was his role?
he is a management accountant.
Thank you. Now, at 8304, we've also got 8304. Thank you. We've got the, underneath the two financial controllers, we've got the Crown Melbourne General Manager Cage and Count reporting to you. Who was that?
It's Mr. Hancock.
And then if we go to where I think the operator wants us to go, 8309, we have the position description for Mr. Preston, the Executive General
Yes.
Manager of Legal and Corporate Services. And we see, if we look down the direct reports, fourth from the bottom, the General Manager of Cage and Count in Perth now reports to him.
Yes,
And was that still Mr. Brown?
yes.
And the reason for him reporting to Mr. Preston is explained at 8302 in the last paragraph. Taken on the responsibility of managing and overseeing the Cage and Count operations. If we go over the page, goes on to say at the top, plays an important role in overseeing corporate governance. And then in the next paragraph is an opinion expressed by Mr. Felsted that the appointment of Mr. Preston to manage and oversee Cage and Count further strengthens compliance within this department because he liaises with AUSTRAC, etc. Goes on to talk about it being a governance issue. Why was there not the same shift at Crown Melbourne to move the reporting structure of the Cage and Count over to legal and compliance?
I don't know.
Well, did you ask at the time?
No, I didn't.
Well, why not? Because it's an oddity, isn't it?
Well, I really didn't turn my mind to it, as I recall. I think as I was leaving Perth, the view was that potentially it might be better to have the GM of the Cage, who was arguably more an operational person than a support person, reporting to somebody who was more on the ground in Perth all the time. I think that may have been one of the motivations, whereas I was in Melbourne and the Cage manager did report to me in Melbourne.
Well, this makes, as we read this, this makes Mr. Preston responsible for the entirety of the Cage operation in Perth. Is that what happened?
Yes.
Well, how did that work? Because you would have still retained financial management responsibility for the Cage as CFO, wouldn't you?
No. As CFO, I was responsible for the financial reporting and management of the business, but the Cage, like other operational areas of our business, was a input into all of that financial data that ultimately found its way through to finance in terms of turning those things into a financial report.
But
the Cage didn't need to report to a finance person for it to perform its duties and have data find its way through to the ultimate end.
Let's go back to your job description at page 8304. This is your job description, and do you see under primary responsibilities there's a series of dot points?
Can you blow it up for me, please? Can't see it.
We're dropping down to the dot points, please. And if we pop
Yes, I can see them now.
and you'll see the second last dot point. This is one of your primary responsibilities, to establish and direct the company's financial activities and procedures. See that?
Yes.
Well, there were financial activities and procedures occurring in the Perth cage, weren't there?
Yes, but there were financial, I think maybe we're at cross purposes. There were financial activities and procedures occurring across the complex, not just in the cage. So when I read that and I understand what it means I and my team are responsible for consolidating all of the inputs across the business in terms of providing useful management financial information for the business to review and make decisions upon.
You see the next dot point, work closely with executive management to ensure the financial processes and controls in each business area are effective and efficient. You see that?
Yes.
So that would included the financial processes and controls in the cage.
Well, again, not necessarily that it's an operational area like other operational areas. When I read that and understand what that means, that's things like appropriate delegated authority policies, appropriate approval policies, appropriate forms to be filling in for capital expenditure requests, business case justifications, those sorts of things is what that means.
So when you moved to CFO Australian Resorts in the period from 2014 to 2017, we'll come to that in a moment because there was another change again, wasn't there, in 2017, who had actual responsibility for making sure that all financial transactions in the cage were recorded accurately and appropriately?
Well, the general manager of the cage ultimately had responsibility, and he reported to me prior to, when was it, April 2013, and reported to Mr. Preston up until around 2017.
So did Mr. Preston have the ultimate responsibility for making sure, amongst other things, the financial transactions in the cage at Perth Casino were accurately and appropriately recorded?
Well, Mr. Preston had responsibility for the cage operations, yes.
So he did.
And I did before and after him.
We were talking about the period 2014 to 2017.
Yes.
Mr. Preston had that responsibility, did he? To make sure all financial transactions in the cage were recorded accurately and appropriately?
Well, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just, the reporting lines for the cage from when I left to join Melbourne, I think it was April 2013, through to about 2017, the cage reported to Mr. Preston. Before that, it reported to me, and after 2017, it reported back into me. So the responsibility for the cage operations ultimately rested with myself and Mr. Preston through that time.
So just come back to the question, who had responsibility for making sure that all financial transactions in the cage at Perth Casino were accurately and appropriately recorded between 2014 and 2017?
Mr. Preston.
Right. And did you have any responsibility in that regard at all?
Not for the responsibility of running the cage in Perth during that period, no. From time to time, we as an executive team would talk about each other's areas of responsibility, if you like, and share information and bounce ideas and the like off us. If that's what you mean in terms of responsibility, then maybe. But there was a reporting line arrangement and a responsibility as there is across the business.
What about the practices and procedures of the cage that were established and followed to achieve accurate and appropriate recording of all financial transactions? Did you have any responsibility for establishing and maintaining those practices and procedures between 2014 and 2017?
Well, again, as I said earlier, there are a significant number of inputs in a financial perspective across the business. We're largely a cash business, and we have operations in tables, machines, hotels, food and beverage, events, conferencing. There are a large number of inputs into financial management of the business. Those inputs ultimately get through to the systems, the management systems of each area, and find their way through to the finance team to prepare and present management reports that are useful for management. There is no, in my mind, there is no one person who is responsible for all of those inputs. They are segregated amongst the business, and there are policies and procedures across the business for managing those things.
So people in the cage are recording financial transactions, aren't they?
Yes.
That's one element of their job. Yes?
Yes.
And it's an important part of financial management to have procedures for the cashiers to follow as to how they record those transactions. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Who had responsibility for establishing and maintaining those procedures between 2014 and 2017?
Well, the procedures in the cage would have been ultimately Mr. Brown's responsibility, and from time to time those procedures would change and would, depending on what was happening and what changes in legislation or various things that might occur.
And you had no responsibility?
Not for changes in standard operating procedures and things like that, no.
But how could you be sure when you received financial information from the cage in Perth that it was reliable to be incorporated into your financial reporting?
Well, frankly, because there is a system in place and there's a hierarchy of people who perform duties, and as a manager in the business, you can't be across all of the documentation. There is a significant amount of policies and procedures across the business. And those policies and procedures from time to time are audited internally, and there's a process, as I understand it, for amending and approving them, and those amendments and approvals need to go through the relevant regulator. So I have some confidence that those sorts of processes were followed.
Did Mr. Preston, to your knowledge, at 2014 have any training or expertise in financial management?
If you mean accounting, then no, I don't think he did.
Did he have any training or experience equivalent to yours?
Not to my knowledge.
That's a convenient time, Commissioner.
We'll go through to 11:30, Mr. Carr, and then take a 30-minute break.
Thank you. Now, if we go to crw.707.001.0354, and here we are at March 2017, Mr. Hume writes to Mr. Connolly with a notification that you are now back responsible for overseeing the cage and count operations at Crown Perth, with the General Manager of Cage and Count now reporting to you rather than Mr. Preston. What was the reason for the change?
I think it was because Mr. Preston had assumed a wider responsibility across the group. He was appointed from memory into a Chief Legal Officer role across the group, as opposed to being responsible largely for Perth operations in his remit. And his portfolio was widening pretty significantly. And so since the cage operations had reported to me, and they did in Melbourne it seemed a logical step for me to pick up that responsibility again in 2017.
But the previous justification to the GWC for moving you out of the cage responsibility in Perth and installing Mr. Preston was that it strengthened the governance over AML risk. You recall that? Yes?
Yes.
So you now had to assume that governance responsibility in relation to AML risk?
No, I didn't see it that way. The fact that Mr. Preston had the cage reporting to him, he had a certain skill set and a certain set of responsibilities that I didn't have. Notwithstanding that, Mr. Preston and the legal teams were always, cognizant of cage operations and, AML and compliance matters generally. So I didn't think that we were losing a lot by a change in reporting line.
You would have still had to, though, work very closely with the AML compliance team in order to make sure that the AML risk mitigation and management was as effective as it could be.
As I said before, that the way it worked was that the teams worked closely together from a senior management perspective and reported up. But yes, I agree with your proposition.
Now, this first page of this letter refers at the arrow points to attached job descriptions that have been amended, one for you and one for the General Manager of Cage and Count. When it comes to the job description for the General Manager of Cage and Count, did you write that job description or have input into it?
I can't recall. I probably would have had input into it, yes.
And who was the General Manager of Cage and Count at this time? Was it still Mr. Brown?
It was still Mr. Brown, yes.
All right, now if we go to that job description at page 0357, 357, I think we'll look at yours first, I beg your pardon. We see there in the first set of dot points under International Business Processes and Systems, if we go cursor up, please, you'll see the second and third last dot points in that section remain the same. You've got responsibility for transactional processing. Do you see there the third last dot point? Ensuring all transactional processing, including taxation, credit policies, etc., are in accordance with policy and procedures, including all relevant legislation?
Yes.
And that included all transactional processing in the cage?
Well, it's not specifically called out, but the cage reported to me.
So my question was, that included all transactional processing in the cage, didn't it?
Well, I guess it could be read that way, but I didn't take it that way in terms of my responsibilities for that. When reading that third dot point, it's more talking about financial transactional responsibilities as they pertain to accounting matters.
You were the CFO, Mr. McGregor. You had ultimate responsibility for ensuring transactions in the cage were recorded properly and accurately, didn't you?
Yes, I'm not disputing that. The cage reported to me.
Now, the job description for the General Manager of Cage and Count begins at 0360. Did you have a look at this last night?
I may have had a quick look through it, yes.
When one reads it, Mr. McGregor, it seems very focused upon customer service to patrons and developing the VIP business and achieving budgetary objectives. Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily. I'd have to have another look at it. It's been a while since I've seen this document, apart from looking at a bundle of documents last night.
But you wouldn't disagree with the proposition that the General Manager of Cage and Count also had responsibility as part of their duties to ensure that transactions in the cage were recorded accurately and appropriately?
Yes.
Now, there's a mention at the top here in this job description of there being 107 direct reports to the General Manager of Cage and Count. Do you see that?
No, I can't. Oh, thank you.
Do you see that?
Yes.
And that's
Yes.
that's made up of the shift managers, supervisors and cashiers that you described earlier.
Yes.
Now, just something that I wanted to ask you about on the way through that caught my eye at 361 at the bottom. There's these different sort of skills areas, I suppose you would say, that are identified in the job description. And on this page, there's service focus and then team building. And if we go down to team building and we look at the professional behaviours that are identified as required as part of the job description, in the last dot point it says managerial courage demonstrated in order to make challenging decisions and hold people accountable. Can you just explain to me what you understand to have been the managerial courage that was required of Mr. Brown in this role?
I can't recall that being in the PD, to be honest. But I think it's a phrase in terms of holding people accountable for their responsibilities.
I don't see the corresponding requirement in your job description. Is there a reason for the difference?
Not that I'm aware of.
You don't perceive there to be a specific requirement for managerial courage in the cage, managing the cage team, as opposed to any other area of the Perth casino business?
No, in fact, I haven't seen that phrase before, or I can't recall seeing it before or anywhere else.
All right. Now, just a point of clarification, again on the way through, Mr. Brown, if we go back to your witness statement at paragraph 22, page 0222, you're now talking about here the role of CFO of the Crown Resorts Limited, the whole group, to which you were appointed in 2020. And do you see in the third sentence, you say most of your focus is on what you consider typical for a CFO, for example, being responsible for the treasury function. Presumably you mean there a treasury function for the whole of the Crown Group?
That's correct.
And how is that treasury function distinct from the finance department and cage operations in each of Perth and Melbourne?
Well, it really has little to do with the cage operations. It is a treasury function that has the key responsibility for primary engagement with our transactional banks and key lenders, cash flow management, managing our financing arrangements, interest payments and the like.
And who heads that treasury function?
It's Mr. Costin.
And he reports to you?
He does now, yes.
In that role as the head of treasury. What's his actual title?
General Manager of Treasury and Corporate Finance.
So that's the group treasury function. And then if we go to paragraph 122 of your witness statement at page 0236, what you're doing here is you're responding to some question that's been posed to you by the Commission regarding people who perform services in relation to the activities of Riverbank Investments Proprietary Limited. And do you see here in this first sentence, you say persons who perform services included representatives from finance, cage, clients, compliance, AML, corporate treasury and the VIP credit team and management. Now, just focusing on corporate treasury here, you say in the second sentence, most of those persons were employed by Burswood Resorts Management Limited. Are you referring to a corporate treasury function specific to Perth, or are you referring there to the group corporate treasury?
The group corporate treasury function.
So you don't understand those people to be employed by Burswood Resorts Management, or you do?
No, they're not. Mr. Costin's report is employed by Crown Resorts Limited.
And insofar as the corporate treasury function has the key responsibility for the banking relationship, do I understand that correctly?
Yes.
They would need...
Could I just ask a question? In that first sentence in paragraph 122, see the last words, the VIP credit team and management? You see that?
Yes.
Are we is that to be read as a composite phrase, or is it the VIP credit team, 1, management 2, or is it the VIP credit team including management?
Yeah, sorry, it's the VIP, it should be together. So it's a VIP credit team and VIP management.
Thank you.
So what I was just asking then was, I think I was reminding you of your evidence that it had the Treasury group had the key responsibility for managing the banking relationship.
Yes.
In that regard, it would need to work closely with the finance department and the cage operations in each of Perth and Melbourne insofar as those operations transacted the bank accounts.
Yes, probably more so the finance teams. The Treasury function would be responsible for cash flow management as well, largely across the group. So, for moving funds around the various bank accounts or corporate entities as required. The liaison, as I understood it, between the corporate treasury team and the cage was more about if, as and when bank accounts, for example, were being opened or closed.
Now, as CFO of Australian Resorts, you continued to attend Burswood Limited meetings as an invitee, I think, didn't you?
Yes.
And in fact, you were required to attend in your capacity as CFO Australian Resorts to inform Burswood Limited directors of any matters relevant to the financial management of the Perth Casino of which they should be aware. Is that right?
That's right.
Did you continue to present budgets to the Burswood Limited board?
Yes, I did. In my capacity as CFO Australian Resorts, I presented budgets and plans to the board in conjunction with the CEO and the Chief Operating Officer.
And you continued to understand that those budgets were not just reviewed but also approved by Burswood Limited?
Yes.
And you also presented the same budgets for review and approval by the CRL board?
Consolidated versions of, yes.
And you continue to attend, you are now back at the ERCC meetings in Perth as a member?
That's right.
So if we go to paragraph 14 at page 0220, so you talk initially about your membership between 2008 to April 2013, which we've already discussed. Then in the second sentence, you say, as Chief Financial Officer of Crown Resorts, I continue to attend as an invitee. So you are no longer a member, or you are a member?
No, so in my capacity in my current role, which is the CFO of Crown Resorts, I am invited to attend the ERCC meetings, but the membership thereof is the executive team of Perth. Similarly, in Melbourne, the ERCC in Melbourne is the executive team in Melbourne, and that comprises the CFO of Australian Resorts.
Thank you.
amongst others. Yeah.
Mr. McGregor and Mr. Donnelly will break now for 30 minutes. So we'll come back at 12 noon our time or 2 p.m. your time.
Thank you.
12 noon.
All rise.
Please be seated. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Mr. Donnelly? Is Mr. Donnelly there?
Yes, I am. I believe my video's disabled, Commissioner.
Just making sure that you're with us.
I am. Thank you.
Ms. Cowell.
Thank you, Commissioner. At page 0224 of your witness statement, paragraph 34. We're talking about here, generally in this section, the training that you've received at Crown Resorts, and in relation to AML training, you say you've participated in AML CTF Director and Executive Management training. When was that?
It was recently. I think it was earlier this year.
And what did that comprise in terms of how long it took and whether it was face-to-face training or something else?
It was a little bit difficult face-to-face with COVID, but it was about an hour to an hour and a half training from memory. It was presented by, as I've said there, an AML partner from Allens and Mr. Blackburn, our newly appointed Chief Compliance and Financial Crime Officer. Therefore, it must have been earlier this year because he started in February.
And have you had any other AML CTF training during your time with the Crown Group?
Other than the online training modules that I've completed over the years, no.
And what did they comprise?
The online training modules that take probably about half an hour that are provided to the business generally, and I think from memory they needed to be completed either once every 1 or 2 years.
Now, coming to your role that you now have and have formerly had since August 2020, if we go to paragraph 11 at page 0220, you say you took that role up from the 23rd of March 2020, but as I understand it, your formal appointment was in August. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And then if we go to page 0222, paragraphs 22 and 23, and in fact 21, what you're trying to do there is explain the differences between your current role and your previous CFO roles. Is that right?
That's correct.
But there is in fact a considerable degree of overlap between the roles, isn't there?
In terms of financial management responsibilities, yes.
And when you say in 22, second sentence, that most of your focus now is what you consider typical for a chief financial officer. You had typical chief financial officer responsibilities in your previous roles, didn't you?
Well, yes, in terms of, as I said, financial management and the like, but when I say typical, I mean for a corporate reporting entity, things like, as I've described in that paragraph, I think, the treasury function, the statutory reporting, statutory reporting and the engagement with a lot of the external parties that I didn't have in the previous role.
Now, in terms of the current financial structure of the Crown Group, Mr. McGregor, does the Burswood Limited Board have the capacity to set or approve a financial budget for the Perth Casino independently of the CRL Board?
No, I don't think it does.
Does the Burswood Limited Board have the capacity independently of the CRL Board to procure funding for the Perth Casino operations or for capital works?
Not to secure funding. Any refinancing arrangements would be managed through the Crown Resorts team. CapEx maybe slightly differently. If there was, or if there were projects that were specific to Perth that warranted investment, that would go to the Burswood Limited board first for approval. And if it was within the parameters of what might have been approved in terms of an overall funding pool, the Burswood Limited board could make a decision in their own right on that.
Thank you. Now, if we go to paragraph 72 at page 0229. You're asked there about certain clauses of the Melbourne Casino Agreement.
Yes.
And you're aware of those clauses, you say?
Yes, I am.
And in particular, clause 22.1 RA3, in which Crown Casino Limited has promised to ensure that CRL maintains Melbourne Casino as the flagship casino of the Crown Resorts gaming business in Australia. You're aware of that clause?
Yes, I am.
In your role as CFO of Crown Resorts, is there anything you do or anything you have done to assist Crown Casino Limited to perform that promise?
No, not specifically, I don't think.
Is it something in your mind as a contractual promise that Crown Casino Limited has to perform when you are performing your role as CFO?
Not really. It certainly hasn't been front of mind prior to sort of late last year. I think this clause came more to my attention towards the end of last year when we were considering pulling out of junkets altogether, because it was sorry, not that clause, I'm thinking about the other one, the predominant program play. Right. Sorry, my apologies. To answer your question, no, not really.
Is it something that you think should figure in your thinking about how to approach your CFO role in the future?
Yes, I think, and look, I've considered this obviously through the last period, through the various inquiries, and my view is that there's little chance in my mind of Crown Melbourne not being the flagship property in the group when you consider its size in particular. It's much, much bigger than the Perth property and obviously much bigger than the Sydney property. So from that perspective, I don't consider there is much risk in the foreseeable future that it will not be the flagship property, so to speak.
In your mind, flagship equates with size?
I think size is an element of it, yes.
Is quality also an element?
Yes.
Quality of amenities?
Yes.
And fixtures and fit out?
Yes, I think all of those things, the quality of the asset, the quality of the offering.
And do you see those sorts of considerations featuring in your approach to the CFO role in the future?
Yes, but I'd consider those as key parts of things to consider for the group generally, not just for Melbourne.
All right, now I want to ask you some specific questions about Riverbank Investments Proprietary Limited. You have already noted at paragraph 8D of your witness statement, page 0220, that you were made a director and secretary of Riverbank Investments Proprietary Limited on your appointment as CFO of Perth Casino in 2007. You obviously had to consent to being appointed to those positions, didn't you?
Yes, that's right.
And did you seek or were you provided with information about the business and the purpose of that company before you gave your consent?
Look, I don't recall. I expect I would have, but that was a long time ago. I don't specifically recall.
If you had, who do you expect you would have sought and received the information from?
Probably the CFO I was replacing.
Who was that?
It was Miss Henwood.
Now, at the time you learnt, didn't you, that Riverbank Investments Proprietary Limited was a subsidiary of Burswood Limited?
That's correct, yes.
You give evidence at various points in your witness statement as to the business or purpose of Riverbank Investments. You found out, didn't you, when you became an officer of the company, that its only function was to hold bank accounts?
That's correct.
And do you remember who told you that?
No, I don't.
Now, obviously, one of the things that you would have done when you commenced as when you commenced as CFO of Perth Casino, was to identify all of the bank accounts that Perth Casino held and what they were used for. Is that right?
Yes, I would have become familiar with that.
And did you, by reason of your position as CFO of Perth Casino, become an authorised signatory to all of the Perth Casino bank accounts?
I can't recall, but I expect I would have.
You learnt, didn't you, in 2007 that there were a number of bank accounts Perth Casino operated into which patrons could deposit monies for gambling?
Yes.
And some of those were in the name of Burswood nominees?
Yes, that's right.
And some were in the name of Riverbank Investments?
Yes.
And you ascertained in 2007, didn't you, that the Riverbank accounts were to be used exclusively for the deposit of monies for gambling by patrons?
That's right, they were patron deposit accounts, yes.
And for patrons who wanted privacy?
Yeah, look, I don't think I turned my mind to it at the time. It was in a bank account that was established before I got there, I think. But certainly that's my understanding.
Well, didn't you understand that though the Riverbank bank accounts were to be used for patrons who did not wish their bankers to be able to see the name of the deposit account to a casino for gambling purposes?
Yes, that's certainly how I understand it now. My qualification is I can't recall whether I was clearly aware of that at the time.
You understood that the money that was paid into one of the Riverbank accounts by or on behalf of a patron would then be transferred into a Burswood nominees bank account used for gambling purposes?
Yes.
And the transfers would take place in the cage?
Yes, I think so.
And the transfers would be performed by cage cashiers?
Yes, I think what happened in the cage was they would view the deposit in the Riverbank account and process a TT, which would effectively, from internal accounting purposes, create a deposit in a DAB account or deposit account balance, if you like, which is that internal piece. In terms of the transactions between bank accounts, that I'm not sure that was the case. I think that may have been the Treasury function, again, moving funds around the various bank accounts.
Do you mean in Melbourne that it was a group function to move amounts between the different accounts?
Yeah, so I'm making a distinction between what the cage did when they received funds across the window versus the monies that were actually in the physical bank account in Riverbank, and they would get swept out of that account from time to time, I think, by the Treasury team.
Well, you used the language of swept out. That was the term that was deployed for this routine practice of transferring monies from the Riverbank account to Burswood nominee accounts.
Yes, cash flow management of various bank accounts, that's right.
The cash flow management, it was just a procedure to always sweep out from the Riverbank accounts the monies in them to the Burswood nominees accounts.
Yes.
And it had nothing.
Yes, I think that's what happened.
It had nothing to do with cash flow, did it? It was just a procedure that was in place to always do that.
I'm not 100% sure of that. As I said, my understanding was that if the Riverbank account or other accounts had excess funds, they would be transferred out of that into some of the other operating accounts.
Well, how could you not be sure of that? The fact of the transfer and the reasons for it as the CFO of Crown Perth, Mr. McGregor?
Well, because it was some time ago and I can't recall exactly whether it was a process, as you've described it, that was regularly undertaken to transfer funds from Riverbank into nominees, or whether it was done on a more ad hoc basis.
Well, why couldn't the funds have been used for gambling directly from the Riverbank bank accounts?
Well, effectively they were. So when somebody would turn up at the cage, they'd have a deposit, have deposited money into a Riverbank account, and the cage would view the amount deposited in the account and verify that the person in front of them had the appropriate receipts and ID. And if all of that checked out, then they would issue them with a chip purchase voucher or chips.
So in that case, there wasn't a sweeping of deposits into a Burswood nominees account?
Not exactly at that point in time, to my knowledge, no.
So that happened later? In relation to the
I'm not clear. I just don't think, and I'm not clear on it. I'd have to check. I just don't think that the transaction at the cage facilitated an immediate transfer from one bank account to another. The funds were in the Riverbank bank account. The cage's job was to check those funds and verify that they were from the person in front of them. And then if they could match it, they would record that transaction in Psycho and issue them with chips or a CPV.
Presumably when the chips were issued, that amounted to a withdrawal from the Riverbank account, is that right?
Yes. Well, yes, it would have been, they're issuing chips, they're not issuing cash. Obviously, we've taken the cash via the deposit onto the Riverbank account.
But so how is that transaction accounted for?
It's funds we've received. It's cash in. It's like somebody coming up to a cage and depositing cash and exchanging them for chips.
And so the transfer of the deposit that relates to the provision of those chips happens later, does it?
As I said, I'm not 100% sure, but I would have thought that's the case, yes.
Did it occur to you at the time that you became a director and officer of Riverbank and you acquainted yourself with this process in relation to the Riverbank investments bank accounts, and in particular the procedure of sweeping that it deposits into other accounts, that was a procedure that was particularly vulnerable to a risk of money laundering occurring?
Look, I don't think I'm obviously aware of it now. It's difficult in some cases to determine what you were aware of that long ago versus what I'm obviously extremely well aware of now, having gone through the various inquiries and read the various papers and things that I have.
Well, Mr. McGregor, you had been around casinos a long time, some 8 years, hadn't you, when you joined Crown Perth?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we established before the break that you understood about the vulnerability of casino operations to money laundering risks. Yes?
Yes.
And it must have been apparent to you that this practice was an obvious money laundering risk.
Yes, I'm not disputing that, yes.
Well, what did you do about it?
Well, there were procedures in place, and there was various parts of the business that had access to the accounts and did certain things with them. So at the time, I didn't do anything in particular in terms of controls or management on that account. There was controls and processes in place, and I accept now that they were the systems and processes were deficient, clearly.
But you must have appreciated that deficiency at the time, Mr. McGregor.
No, clearly not. Otherwise, I would have done something about it.
And we just go to page 0235, 116 to 118 of your witness statement. You say you've reviewed many documents for the two Royal Commissions, and from your review of those documents you understand the following, and you go on to talk about some matters around Riverbank.
Yes.
And the reason for the accounts being to provide patrons with privacy. You see that?
Yes, I do.
That's not something you learned from the Royal Commissions. That's something you knew back in 2007, wasn't it?
Yes, as I said, I can't recall whether I turned my mind to the specific reason as to why Riverbank existed. I can't remember anybody particularly asking. Clearly, it came out in earnest through 2019 and the media attention and the fact that the name of the account was Riverbank and Southbank for that matter in Melbourne.
Now, your reflection that you just made a moment ago, that you did not appreciate the AML risk and vulnerabilities in the operation of the Riverside bank accounts between 2007 and 2013, do you accept that your failure to identify those risks at the time was a lack of diligence, because of a lack of diligence on your part?
I accept that I accept that casinos generally are vulnerable to AML processes. And I think, as I said, I think our systems and our processes at the time, and indeed leading up to, more recent times, were not what they should be.
But you bear a responsibility for that, don't you?
Yes. Yes, I think I do.
When you were CFO of Crown Perth, was Riverside Investments Pty Ltd the subject of an annual external financial audit?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Why was that?
It just wasn't. There wasn't a external financial audit of Riverbank Investments Limited. It was if you're talking about the external audit process, they would have, and it was EY back then, I think, would have audited the consolidated group of which Riverbank was a part, and they would have sought bank confirmations for all of the various bank accounts and got them as part of their audit, but there wasn't a specific audit into the transactions and activities of Riverbank, as I recall.
Do you think on reflection there should have been?
Certainly on reflection, there should have been more attention given to the activities and the transactions through Riverbank.
And again, you bear responsibility, don't you, for the fact that there wasn't?
I bear some responsibility for that, yes.
Significant responsibility. You were the CFO.
Well, there was, as I said, I bear some responsibility for it. There are others, obviously, in the business that oversaw the same thing. So I'm not disputing the fact that there were deficiencies in the systems and the processes. That is clear and has been the point of quite a bit of commentary over the last few years, and our focus has been on making sure that we can fix that.
Is there anyone more responsible than you for what occurred on the Riverbank accounts?
Oh, I'm not sure. I mean, there was a number of us who had responsibility through that period across the business.
You're not sure if...
So I'm not...
Sorry, you go.
My apologies.
No, please answer. You can complete your answer, Mr. McGregor.
Sorry. I think all of us who have been involved through that period in senior positions would take some responsibility for what has occurred through the Riverbank and South Bank accounts, for that matter, in terms of what has arisen in recent times.
And who are
It happened on our watch.
All right. So who are those people that you were referring to in addition to yourself?
Well, it's the senior management teams who were responsible through that period.
So just provide the names, please, Mr. McGregor.
Well, the CEO, the CFO, the legal and compliance teams, the VIP teams, the VIP working group.
Sorry,
There was a number of people who had coverage of this.
Name the people you regard as responsible for what occurred with the Riverbank accounts.
Well, ultimately, it was the management of the group. So, throughout the period, and look, I'm sorry, I can't recall all of them. This is from 2007 right up until the present day. So there is a number of individuals who have occupied positions through that period.
Just give me the names of the ones you remember.
Okay, so it was obviously Mr. Felstead, Mr. Barton, Mr. Craigie, those involved with the legal and compliance side of things.
So the names, please.
If I may object to, it might assist the witness if there's a time period placed on the relevant questions that are being asked by my learned friend, because sorry, bear with me, because as the questions have been asked, and indeed the questions suggest, it's a very wide period of time.
You see, I think there's something in that 2007 to the present day is a very long period.
I can find that.
Thank you.
Mr. McGregor, in terms of what happened on the Riverbank account between 2012 and 2017, who are the people who bear responsibility for that?
In my mind, it is those people who had responsibility for various parts of the operation of the account. So,
just name names, please. I just want names.
Obviously. So it was myself, because I was responsible for the cage. Mr. Preston was variously responsible for the cage and AML, Mr. Felstead, Mr. Craigie, Mr. Spence. Those are the sorts of names I can remember through that period.
Can you remember any others?
Not off the top of my head.
All right. Now let's come to 2013. In 2013, now this is at the point at which you're moving to Melbourne. You're in the sort of second quarter of 2013. And you became aware, didn't you, that in 2013 HBSC shut down the Riverbank accounts?
Yes, I was copied on some emails at the time.
And you understood that that was on the basis that HBSC no longer wanted to provide banking services to the gaming sector generally?
That's correct.
And it was at that stage that the Riverbank accounts were moved to ANZ in the October of 2013. You were aware of that?
I wasn't necessarily aware of it at the time. I'm very aware of it now.
Did you become a signatory on the ANZ accounts in the name of Riverbank Investments?
I don't know. I'm not sure that I would have, because at that time I was in a Crown Melbourne centric role.
Have you not checked for the purposes of the various inquiries that have taken place recently?
I haven't checked that I was a signatory of the ANZ account back in 2013, no.
Why not?
Well, it didn't occur to me to check. I may have been a signatory, I don't know.
Do you know if Mr. Preston was a signatory?
No, I don't.
You're aware, weren't you, that ANZ closed the Riverbank and South Bank accounts in relation in about July 2014?
The ANZ account?
Yes,
And
sorry.
yes, I'm aware of that now.
And Mr. Travis Costin was involved in discussing with, together with Mr. Barton, with ANZ, that closure between around January and July 2014.
Yes, that's my understanding.
You were aware at the time that they were having those discussions with the ANZ?
No, I wasn't.
You weren't aware at all?
Not that I recall, no.
You were aware at the time that ANZ had closed the accounts, though?
No, I don't recall being aware of the ANZ closure at the time.
Are you saying nobody told you that the Riverbank and South Bank accounts with ANZ had been closed?
It was only a Riverbank account, from my knowledge, that ANZ had for a short period of time, and during that time I was in the Melbourne role. So they may not have told me because I may not have been a signatory to that account in Riverbank. But I don't recall being aware of the ANZ closure at the time.
Surely, though, the closure of a bank account by a reputable bank is a very significant thing to happen within a corporate group. Would you agree?
Yes. Yes.
And it's implausible, isn't it, that you would not have either been told or learnt at the time of the fact of that closure?
Well, not necessarily. I was the CFO of Crown Melbourne at the time. There was a CFO of Crown Perth. There was a CFO of Crown Resorts, and there was a treasury function. The CFO of Crown Resorts and the treasury team were dealing with the banks and would have been dealing with the CFO in Perth on this matter. So it wasn't a bank account that I had coverage of in my Melbourne role at the time.
Well, you became the CFO of Australian Resorts in August 2014, didn't you?
Yes.
So a month after the Riverbank accounts were closed, you became effectively CFO of Crown Perth.
Yes.
And are you saying that you didn't learn then that the ANZ bank accounts had been closed?
I don't think I did, no. I may have learnt in and around that time. I can't recall. I think it was when they were opening up CBA accounts, I became aware, which was soon afterwards. Yeah.
And because they were opening up CBA accounts, you must have learnt the reason why they were doing that.
I don't recall learning the reason why at the time.
Well, but Mr. McGregor, you were the CFO of Crown Perth at the time, and they're opening.
No, I was the CFO.
Sorry?
Sorry, I was the CFO of Crown Melbourne at the time.
In August 2014, you became the CFO of Australian Resorts, didn't you?
Yes, I think that's right.
Which made you effectively the CFO of Crown Perth.
Yes, in the Australian Resorts role, yes.
Yeah. And while you were CFO of Australian Resorts, the CBA bank accounts were opened, weren't they?
Yes.
And you must have understood in the role of CFO why they were being opened.
Look, I'm sorry, I just don't recall from that period being aware of them.
Well, you must have, Mr. McGregor, mustn't you? Because if they were being opened, you had to understand why.
Again, I'm sorry, I don't recall why they were open or the process for opening them. They were done by the Treasury team and Crown Resorts at the time.
Can I show you this document, Mr. McGregor, CRL.557.001.0807. Now, you don't appear to be a recipient of this email, so I'm not suggesting that you were. But you'll see it's dated the 29th of April 2014 from
Yes.
Mr. Roland Tyler.
Yes.
Is that how you pronounce his name?
That is, yes.
And he's emailing to a range of people. He's from Crown Melbourne in the VIP section, is he?
That's right.
Do you see the reference to Jason O'Connor at Crown Melbourne?
Yes.
What was his role?
He was in charge of VIP international business.
And Jacinta Carreri?
She was a finance manager in the VIP team.
And Valerie Plowman?
I don't know who Valerie Plowman is.
CC'd to Mr.
I
Barton.
think she might have. She may have been a credit person, I think, from memory.
In the VIP team or otherwise?
In the VIP team.
All right. And then CC'd to Mr. Barton, who was the CFO of CRL at the time.
That's correct.
Sorry, can someone just remind me who Deborah Taccone was at that point? What role she had?
Yeah, Deb Taccone was the Executive General Manager of Legal at Crown Melbourne.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, Mr. Tyler explains about the closure of the accounts with the ANZ, and if we drop down to numbered paragraph 3, we've already instructed our relevant office managers to advise customers not to make multiple deposits under $10,000, and we will continue to remind them. Do you see that?
Yes.
Were you aware that office managers within the Crown Group had been given that direction at April 2014?
I don't recall.
Do you see the email below from Mr. Costin?
Yes.
The 29th of April. Just remind me what Mr. Costin's role was at the time.
He was in the Treasury team for Crown Resorts Limited.
And who's Mr. Nielsen?
Mr. Nielsen was the General Counsel for Crown Resorts.
All right. And if we cursor down, please, so we can see the whole page. Referring to meetings with ANZ regarding the Riverbank Investments account that Mr. Barton and he had, and you say you were unaware of these meetings at the time.
That's right. I wasn't involved in those meetings, and I was unaware of them at the time, as I recall.
And goes on to say ANZ's advised they'll be closing Riverbank Investments, and has also advised that the Asian patron deposit accounts for South Bank investments in Hong Kong and Singapore are to be closed. You see that?
I can't quite see that. You might have to blow that up for me. I'm sorry. I can just look at the whole page at the moment. Sorry, where are you referring me to there?
Second paragraph. ANZ have advised that they will be closing the Riverbank investments accounts, etc. Second line.
Yes.
Have also advised that the Asian patron deposit accounts for South Bank investments in Hong Kong and Singapore are to be closed.
Yes.
And you say you weren't told that at the time, even though you were the CFO of Crown Melbourne.
I don't recall being told that at the time. I may have been. I don't recall.
Well, it's likely you were, wasn't it?
Well, again, not necessarily. The engagement with the banks was carried out by the Crown Resorts team and the Treasury team in conjunction with the VIP team, which are clearly Mr. Tyler and his team. So I wouldn't necessarily have, well, I clearly wasn't involved in the meetings. Whether they copied me in on some correspondence post this with respect to the changes they may have, I just don't recall.
Did you decline to be involved in the meetings with ANZ?
No, I wasn't invited to be involved.
Let's stay with this email. It says the closure of the Riverbank accounts, are you with me? Was expected. Do you see that?
I can see that, yes.
But not by you. Not
I'm
by-
sorry?
It says the closure of the Riverbank accounts was expected. My question to you is, but not by you. Is that the case?
Who's the author of this email? It's Mr. Costin. Yes, that's right.
And these accounts are in the process of being transitioned to CBA. You weren't aware of that in April, is that right?
No, that's right.
Then it says, can customers be advised by relevant people that multiple cash deposits in branch under the $10,000 reporting threshold will not be accepted in the new CBA accounts? See that?
Yes.
Well, surely you were told at this point in your role as CFO of Crown Melbourne that in the new CBA accounts, those multiple cash deposits were not going to be accepted.
I don't recall being told of that
My
at the
question,
time.
my question to you is, surely you must have, Mr. McGregor.
Well, again, all I can say is I don't recall being involved in this matter at the time. Clearly, I wasn't involved in the meetings. I wasn't copied in the email. I don't recall being aware of it at the time.
Are you sure about that?
Yes, I'm sure about that.
You sure that you don't?
Unless, pardon?
Are you sure you don't remember?
That's right. I might stand to be corrected if there's some email traffic out there that copies me on some correspondence. There may be, but I do not recall at the time being aware of these changes.
And this reference to customers being advised that multiple cash deposits would not be accepted in the new CBA accounts, can you shed any light on why there does not appear to be a direction to those who are sweeping deposits out of the Riverbank and South Bank accounts not to aggregate them?
No, I can't shed any light on that.
And do you recall informing the Burswood Limited board at the time that the ANZ bank accounts were closed of that fact?
No, as I said, I wasn't aware of it at the time.
What about the opening up of the CBA accounts later in the year?
No.
You didn't inform
No.
the Burswood Limited board about that?
No, not that I recall.
Why not?
Well, I don't recall being aware of the changes.
You were aware of the CBA accounts being opened.
I'm not sure I was at the time. I'm obviously aware of all of the changes now and the dates thereof, but I don't remember being aware of these changes in 2014.
Can I take you please to crw.538.003.3794, which is an email chain in October 2014. I'll come back to it. Can I come forward 4 to 5 years? In late July 2019, there was a 60 Minutes program that aired in Australia, and you saw it or were made aware of its contents at the time, weren't you?
Yes.
and included within the program commentary on Crown's relationship with junket operators,
Yes.
and you're aware it included allegations of money laundering by overseas patrons at Crown's casinos.
Yes.
That must have heightened your concerns about AML risk around, in particular, the Riverbank and South Bank bank accounts, I suggest.
Yes.
Did you do anything by way of immediate response to that program?
I recall at the time I probably would have spoken to both of the cage managers at the time about the program, and in and around that time I was also invited to attend some of the meetings with the banks because Mr. Barton and Mr. Costin were undertaking some refinancing or looking to undertake some refinancing activity. And because of the media attention or speculation or the media programs, the banks we met with, which were relationship banks, had asked to have presentations on the joint AML program and improvements in our AML processes at that time, which was in and around the airing of the media program. So I was also very aware of what the legal and AML teams were undertaking at that time through the meetings that we had with the banks.
You were meeting with the banks on this occasion?
I was invited to attend with the banks with Mr. Barton and Mr. Costin, yes.
Why on this occasion and not when ANZ closed its bank accounts?
Because this was later in 2019 and Mr. Barton had invited me to attend the meetings with the banks because, as I said, it was a refinancing process, and probably for my own development, he invited me to participate.
Can we go back to the email chain of the October 2014 CRW.538.003.3794? We go to the bottom, please, the second half of 3794. You are forwarded an email from Mr. Preston on the 23rd of October asking for your thoughts. We see the forwarded email at 3796. See there that Mr. Durando is explaining to Mr. Preston about having received a batch of smaller deposits, all less than the threshold of $10,000, totalling about $100,000. There's no reference attached to the deposits, all made to the Riverbank account, etc. And then if we go over to 3795, Mr. Durando says he's now got receipts for the individual transactions. Says the only positive is that they're in-branch deposits on this occasion and not quick cash deposits. Still under the threshold, but opportunity for the bank to report as suspicious. Note there, not Crown, but the bank. He then asks what to do, and Mr. Preston forwards that on to you for your thoughts. And then at 3794 top, you give your response.
Yes.
3794. You think it sounds a bit curious. Well, it's a bit more than curious, isn't it, Mr. McGregor? It's an obvious AML alert, isn't it?
It's a red flag, yes.
Yeah. And it was typical in these situations for Mr. Preston to involve you to ask you what to do about a red flag for AML.
No, I don't think it was typical. He reached out on this occasion, and this is back in 2014, I don't actually recall. I suspect we had a conversation about it. That's where we had kind of left it in the email chain. We would have discussed it, I think, and taken the appropriate action. Well,
what appropriate action did you take in response to this transaction that you were alerted to?
Yeah, I don't remember. It was a long time ago. I suspect I would have had a conversation with Mr. Preston. We would have discussed it and instructed, and Mr. Preston probably passed on some comments or instructions to Mr. Durando.
Just coming back to the 60 Minutes report in 2019, Mr. McGregor, did you yourself do anything in the wake of that program to put in place steps to further mitigate the risk of money laundering at Perth Casino?
Personally, no, not that I recall.
Now, in October 2019, CBA closes its accounts for both South Bank and Riverbank. You recall that?
Yes.
We go to CRL.605.016.7020. You'll see here that you are CC'd into this email from Mr. Costin. Do you see your name?
Yes, I see that.
Line? This is on the 4th of October 2019. And he and Mr. Barton have met with CBA, formally given notice about the closure of South Bank and Riverbank investment accounts, and goes on to say they're working to attempt to open new patron accounts. Now, surely you must have been very concerned when you got this news.
Yes.
And you must have appreciated that CBA apprehended an AML risk on the Riverbank and South Bank accounts that it held for that company, for those companies.
Yes.
So how did you respond to this email, Mr. McGregor?
I don't recall specifically how I responded to this email, but there was a lot of work going on at the time by the legal and AML teams in investigating the allegations from the 60 Minutes program in the media generally. We were undertaking an upgrade of the AML program and launching a joint AML program at that time. I was aware of that and involved in some of the meetings where that was presented to the various boards and committees. And I was aware that some of the AML team under Mr. Preston were investigating these matters pretty thoroughly at the time.
Well, what were they doing?
They were investigating the matters that were raised by the media.
Sorry, in relation to the closure of the CBA accounts, was there an investigation into the reasons why?
Not specifically to my recollection, no.
Well, there should have been, shouldn't there?
Potentially, and look, they may have been investigated as part of the AML team's investigations. I know Ms. Lane, when she was with us, was involved in investigating a number of the accounts and the transactions through Riverbank and the like. Unfortunately, she left later that year, in and around the time we were launching the joint AML program, and then her replacement came on board later in 2019.
Would you agree, as CFO of Perth and Melbourne, you needed, at the point of the closure of the CBA, Riverbank and South Bank accounts, to be proactively involved in understanding the reasons for the closure and what adjustments needed to be made to the financial management of Crown Perth and Crown Melbourne to avoid that happening with another bank?
Yes, I accept that I could and should have been more involved at the time.
Were you looking to disengage yourself from the obvious risks of money laundering that attended the Riverbank and South Bank accounts?
No.
Were you looking to avoid responsibility for the obvious AML risk that was occurring in relation to the management of the Riverbank and South Bank accounts?
No, I don't think so. I think I accepted some responsibility in our previous discussion.
In your role as Director and Secretary of Riverbank Investments between 2007 and April 2013, and also as CFO of Crown Perth during that period, you must have known whether Riverbank Investments was or was not registered as a reporting entity with AUSTRAC. Do you agree?
No, I don't. I wasn't aware of that at the time from 07 to 13.
Well, you should have been, shouldn't you, as an officer of that company?
Probably.
And as CFO of Crown Perth?
Yes, probably.
So what is your explanation for the possibility that you didn't know?
I don't have an explanation for why I didn't know. We became aware of those matters. I became aware of them, and others, I'm sure, through the Bergen inquiry and the evidence that was provided through there.
Was there a conscious decision by the board of Riverbank Investments while you were a director of that company to not report into AUSTRAC?
No, not to my knowledge.
Did Riverbank Investments, during your tenure as an officer, seek or receive legal advice about whether it needed to report to AUSTRAC?
I don't know. I'm not. I wasn't privy to those conversations.
As a director and secretary of Riverbank Investments between 2007 and April 2013, and as CFO of Crown Perth during that period, do you know whether Riverbank Investments Proprietary Limited was included within the Crown Perth or CRL AML compliance program?
My understanding was that it was. My understanding of the program and the reporting obligations through to AUSTRAC was that all of the patron accounts were captured and all of the reporting that was required to be done to the authorities was done. Through the Bergen inquiry, I learned that Riverbank Investments Limited was in fact not part of the designated business group or a reporting entity. But notwithstanding that, my understanding was that we treated them as such.
But Mr. McGregor, how could that be something that you misunderstood at the time, given your role as CFO of Crown Perth? Because surely it would have been your responsibility to check that.
I can't explain why I or others did not realise that at the time.
Commissioner, can I just get an indication from you of when you want to have a further break?
Around 1 p.m. Mr. McGregor and Mr. Donnelly will break now for 1 hour and come back at 2 p.m. our time, which is 4 p.m. your time.
Thank you, Commissioner.